All right, next on our agenda is what is a statistical study? So when we're talking about the steps of a statistical study, or really if you think the steps of the scientific research process, the first thing we need to do is we need to define the purpose of our study. So here's an overview of the scientific method. Um, and you can see it's circular because we go through this and it continues to help inform what we're doing. So the first step is that we may think about interesting questions. We formulate hypotheses. We develop testable predictions. We then gather our data based on what our predictions are. We may continue to refine or alter or expand or reject our hypotheses. And then we can develop general theories based on that. Another way to think about the scientific research method is that you ask a question. Then you got to go do a little background research. You got to read other people's writings. You got to do a literature search, and you guys are going to learn about how to do literature reviews in your other courses. You may construct a hypothesis or a prediction about what you may think may be occurring. Then you're going to actually go through and test your hypothesis by doing an experiment. You'll analyze your data, draw your conclusions, explain what happened, and then you got to really tell us why, what happened, what it means, and why it may be useful for us. And you got to share those results. So what is research? Research is a formal, systematic, rigorous process of inquiry used to generate and test a theory. If you look at nursing research textbook, this one from Foster and Garrity calls it a formal and systematic, rigorous process of inquiry used to generate and test theories about the health-related experiences of human beings within their environment and about the actions and processes that nurses use in practice. Really, it boils down to this: is that research generates new knowledge, while evidence-based practice uses existing evidence to improve patient care. And that's really what you guys are learning about in your program, is how to take evidence and apply it to practice. And so there's this symbiotic relationship between people who do research and people who do predominantly evidence-based practice projects. And it doesn't mean that you can't do one or the other. Researchers can do both, as well as nurse anesthetists who got a DNP or a DNAP certainly can do research. With the appropriate, with additional support in those areas that they may be weak on. The key is having a good team. So why do we do research? Well, the most common purposes are we either want to describe or explain something. Maybe we want to predict something. We want to explore, and we want to discover. Empirical research is where we're gaining knowledge by means of direct or indirect observation or experience. And we develop these research questions from clinical problems. What we talked about earlier is PONV. What might be some drugs that are best at decreasing PONV? Another research question that I've been working on in my research is, does CPAP, or continuous positive airway pressure, decrease peripartum complications in parturients at high risk for obstructive sleep apnea? That's an example of a research question. Another one may be an example you may see is we may need to understand or describe a phenomenon where there's maybe not a lot of research out there that would allow us to move to higher levels of research studies like experimental designs or randomized controlled trials. The lowest level of evidence is really descriptive, even correlational studies. But here you may be examining, call shift fatigue in CRNAs and describing that phenomenon. And a former classmate of mine who worked on her PhD, Ramona Doman, published an article in ANA on this particular topic if you're interested in it. In contrast between research and evidence-based practice or evidence-based healthcare, and this is taken from the JAMA EBHC, their JAMA evidence book, but it's really the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. And it requires that we integrate individual clinical expertise, patient preferences, and the best available external clinical evidence from research and consideration of available resources. Evidence-based practice is where is a clinical practice in which patient management decisions are consistent with the principles of evidence-based healthcare. So here's a nice figure that illustrates when we're going through a questioning practice. We talked about, when you do research, that's where we're generating new knowledge to help inform our practice. Then when we're doing EBP, we're taking that evidence and we're applying it to practice, either in an individual patient or maybe in a QI or PI project to help improve patient care processes or outcomes within our organization. So what about defining the purpose of the study? This is one of the sometimes a little bit more confusing topic for students, and I certainly took me a while to wrap my head around these different terms. And I don't want you guys to get too spun up on the terminology that we use, and you may hear it stated slightly different ways in different resources or textbooks. But the most important first step is once you've identified that you're thinking about this clinical problem, you need to develop a research question, or really need to think about what is the purpose, why are you doing this study? And so you might think about the purpose of your study. You want to transform it into a question, because we use questions first when we're designing a study. And so, for example, you may read a journal article that presents a purpose statement or hypothesis, which is a predicted relationship rather than a question. But when we write research questions, you're planning for planning a project, as I just mentioned, and you're dealing in the future tense about what you will or won't do. So when we use research questions, those questions help guide the design and methodology of the study. And so you may read in some published articles, they may, in some nursing journals, they may actually present their formal research questions. In most medical journals, and certainly in anesthesia, many times you're just going to see maybe a hypothesis statement or a problem statement or research aims. And many times, most studies, they're designed around a primary research question, and they may have one or more secondary research questions. So here is another good thing to think about when you're looking at what makes up a good research question is, one, it's got to be feasible. Meaning, is it feasible if it's answerable by the resources do you have? I mean, can you get it done? I've worked with a lot of PhD students, and sometimes they want to save the world. And sometimes we have to carve it down to what we can really get done with the resources or the time that we have, especially when you're students. It's got to be interesting to you. This is something you may be working on for a number of years, or if you're a researcher, you may be working on a program of research for the rest of your career. Is it something novel? Sometimes we do replication studies, but many times you want it to be novel because you want to fill those gaps. You want to generate that new knowledge. It has to be ethical. You always have to go through, if you're using human subjects research, getting IRB approval, or if you're using animal research, going through what's called an IACUC. And it needs to be relevant. Are the results of the proposed study potentially going to change clinical practice, support policy making, or encourage future research? So what are some different types of research questions that I talked about? And so this is where initially you're formulating or designing that study. And one textbook that I've used, they describe it as level 1, level 2, and level 3. So a level 1 research question is really where we're at that basic level of science, where there's not a lot of published research or data on a particular topic. For example, what is the rate of call shift fatigue in CRNAs? My good friend Ramona Doman did her PhD work on this. Part of it is that she had a passion about it, and so it helped drive her for a number of years. But she had discovered there really wasn't a lot out there. And so really, when there's little knowledge or theory behind some phenomenon, we want to do descriptive, or sometimes we call these observational studies. level 2 type question. We're getting a little bit more knowledge in theory. This is an example would be maybe what is the relationship between call shift fatigue and medical errors in CRNAs? Maybe we have that initial study and now we're looking at a little bit more a higher level research design where we're starting to potentially look at relationships or making predictions. And then a level 3 question would be, an example would be, does the administration of caffeine decrease the rate of call shift fatigue in CRNAs? So this may lend itself to a randomized controlled trial or some quasi-experimental design. And quasi-experimental just means that it's missing one or more of the true characteristics of a randomized controlled trial, which we will talk about in later lectures. How do we identify research problems? Well, these may be clinical problems or observations from our day-to-day practice. So here's an example from a study we did with some of my SRNAs a number of years ago. Some women we noticed have delayed motor recovery despite dilute local anesthetic admixtures after vaginal delivery. Anecdotally, we saw some providers who used to administer a saline bolus through the epidural catheter to hasten motor block resolution. But there was a lot of research in surgical populations, but not a lot in the OB literature, specifically in women getting a laboring epidural. So the students went through, they did a literature review using surrounding a PICO question to help search the literature. They identified gaps. They identified that there was not a lot of research on a saline bolus through an epidural catheter to hasten motor block recovery after vaginal delivery. And so they designed a study where in fact they tested that hypothesis that a 30 cc saline bolus after vaginal delivery would significantly hasten the time to full motor block recovery in women who received the dilute local anesthetic admixture. So that gives you an example of how we would think through that initial steps of the research process. Where would you go to find literature for a literature review? You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You want to do a literature review because it's going to help you identify the gaps, the problems, some background literature surrounding a problem. It's going to allow you to identify important variables that you need to measure or control for. They may not be the primary variable of interest, but it's something that may impact your outcomes. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It also does help you answer the so what question. Is the problem we're studying, will it generate new knowledge? Will it result in changes in clinical practice? So we're going to take a little break here, and when you're ready, continue the next video in this lecture.